Our final speaker, final panellist before we move to the debate is Mark Johnson, who's a senior advisor at the EPC, but that's the latest in Mark's series of hats that Mark has worn in his long service on the energy and climate change front in Brussels.
Thank you, Simon. It'll be 11 years in September in this city. So Chris said we might boil like Venus if we get this wrong, and there was a snigger around the room. But probably it's an exaggeration. But at least it's a useful way to remind ourselves really what we're up against. If you think that was a gross exaggeration, then, and we heard it again today, what the IEA is saying consistently now for some time, that the world is on track for between 4 and 6 degrees of climate change, perhaps 2, 3, but maybe even 4 times the limit that is regarded as safe. The UNFCCC's ultimate objective is to stabilize CO2 concentrations in the world on the safe side of dangerous, we're a long way from that at present. The main point I want to make this morning is, whilst I have some experience, and we can go into the detail of the CCS debate in Brussels and in Europe since it began 6-7 years ago, I don't think we're going to resolve those questions, those issues, until this set of political institutions and everything that's a part of that, member states, companies, countries, citizens, etc., begin to understand the overall scale and urgency of the situation we're in. There's a debate ongoing about a 2030 package for Europe of domestic measures, of which the CCS communication is sort of a part. But that, having spent a day with DG Energy and DG Climate Action last Wednesday, that debate seems to me to be very lackluster. It doesn't seem to have any principles behind it, first of all, and it seems to be contaminated with, and you heard it again from Marie this morning, contaminated with a debate or a dominant theme about competitiveness. Competitiveness is not an insignificant issue, but if we and all of the world is on a trajectory towards a climate catastrophe, and we are, however it's described, then really competitiveness has to be a second order issue to that systemic or perhaps even existential crises that we're in. The world faces many crises, of which sovereign debt, banking, economic crises are just several, but there are others out there, both on climate and other aspects of environmental protection. So we as Europe, and we like to think we're in the lead on Europe, are still struggling with this issue. To me, that personally, and this is a big part of my motivation for trying to make things in Europe work better, is that if you think about for a moment the reasons why Europe started after World War II, to ensure that systemic and existential issues such as real fighting across this continent and elsewhere, never happen again. And the success of that over 60 years is the reason we won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Think forward from now 50 or 60 years and think about all that you've heard about climate change. Would Europe be in the running, in a good position to win another Nobel Peace Prize around the middle of this century, if we are, depending on exactly how you analyze it, either heading for the danger zone or already in it? So we have to, in order to deal with CCS, and I'll come to that in a second, we have to reorganize the politics and the priorities of the European institutions to do that. I think one principle that should be on the table is the principle of adequacy. I thoroughly detest the word ambition that many climate diplomats use because it's an excuse for not talking about adequacy. And another principle that should be on the table and is sort of there but rather weak is that Europe should pursue its domestic and its international actions side by side. We can't have one without the other. Some people would like to say domestic only and international can wait. Others, Poland for example, at the moment as a country chairing UNFCCC later this year, would rather say that international must come first and domestic can wait. We have to go forward on the basis of both together if we're to deal with this. One very encouraging sign yesterday in Luxembourg was the agreement by foreign ministers on new and revised conclusions on global climate diplomacy. As a text, very strong. We need to make sure that gets put into, sorry, excuse me a second. We need to make sure that text gets put into action. Europe now has the resources to do that because we now have a new foreign service since 2.5 years ago with 4,000 staff, £500 million a year budget, 20 times the staff that Connie Hedegaard has in her department, and yet we're not using it so far to deal with this global environmental crisis. That has to change. On CCS itself, I mean, I don't take very strong positions these days either way on CCS. I think given the overall problem, which we have to understand on Act on Better, solving that in time is essentially a 4-horse race over the next 4 decades. Energy efficiency and energy savings, renewables, fossil fuels with CCS pollution control, and to some extent nuclear. In a European setting, to a large extent, although not entirely, specific decisions about each of those, and especially the more contentious ones, like nuclear and CCS, will at least for now remain a national decision. The in-principle decision to use those options or not, so far, remains a national one. And that's the basis on which we've organised at the European level. CCS in that sense only is not unlike shale gas, where again the in-principle decision to use it or not will be taken at the national level, and the approach at the European level, which is now in preparation, is to ensure the right framework of environmental safeguards. And for the CO2 storage directive, that's exactly what happened in that framework law 5 years ago when Chris was in charge of it in this House. Probably the demonstration programme envisaged from 2007 onwards, I think, was too big to get started. Instead of up to 12, perhaps then we should have focused on a smaller number. And looking at the situation now, I think the best way forward is to get going with 1 or 2 projects and to give those projects focused help. That may involve pooling resources, at least the resources we have at the European level. It seems rather less than effective to have 3 separate pots of money at the European level at the present time. The other thing about having fewer demonstration projects is that the companies involved should come together more. We need to see more joint ventures. Sometimes the companies have been rather cautious about preserving intellectual property. One can understand the motive of that, but given what we're up against, that has to be tempered against the need to get on with stuff, test it, learn from it. And once demonstration is demonstrated, then if it's all okay, deployment can start. One of the mistakes as well in recent years, I think, as an observer, has been that often demonstration and deployment have got mixed up with each other. Last point on the 2 main sets of policy options in the Commission's recent paper. They are not mutually exclusive. You can have a new CO2 pollution control standard, an emission performance standard, at least for new power plants, perhaps starting with coal, but ultimately applying to ultimately applying to gas too. In the same way that the controls on SO2 and NOx have evolved over the last 25 years, there can be revisions of a law that lead to an expansion of scope, for example, from new plant to existing plant. That standards approach, which tends to be liked more by the environmental groups because they prefer the polluter pays principle over facilitation with public resources, can go alongside the other main option in the policy paper, which is an obligation shared across many member states. If you think they don't go together, then look exactly what's happening now in the United States. And indeed, when President Obama speaks this evening, on his climate plan in relation to large installations, that's exactly what the US are doing. They have a regulatory standard, in effect banning new coal without CCS, and in addition, resources that help take forward demonstration. But I'll pause there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Good. Okay, let's start by giving some of the panellists the opportunity to come back on some of the points the other panellists have made. I don't know, Chris, is there anything particularly you want to come in on? I mean,
yeah, only two things.
Mark, can you switch your mic off because they don't automatically.
EPS, emissions performance standards. I mean, on the whole, there may be a role for them, as Mark suggests, but on the whole, I don't believe that's the way forward. I think that apart from anything else, I just think there's just too much political opposition. An EPS pretty well means no new coal without CCS, and I just don't think that's going to be politically acceptable at the moment. So I think we have to find a way of making sure that all electricity generators in one way or another are contributing to the development of CCS without penalising one particular sector. The other thing is the problem with the general discussion. I mean, it is general. I mean, just having far too many discussions about the need for CCS and about, without saying, okay, how are we actually going to achieve it? Because we could have had much of the conversations we've had so far in the last half hour, we could have had in 2008. And we have to move on and put solutions on the table.
I don't really want to come back in some of the comments. I'm rather interested to hear some of the solutions that people in the audience might have to offer for us, because I'm here with a blank page ready to take notes.
Yeah, I think Chris actually mentioned this concept of market failure, and this actually could provide actually some light of what needs to be done. Obviously, I mean, if you use the atmosphere to inject CO2 in it, you have a market failure, and that is actually corrected by the emission trading scheme. But given that CCS is an emerging technology, it actually has additional risks which need to be mitigated pretty much like renewables have. And the rationale for policy intervention basically is to correct these types of market failure which come together with an emerging technology. And we do have, particularly from the renewable side, we do have basically a portfolio of instruments available which actually are used in the Commission. And it could be wise, perhaps, to actually look what has worked with renewables and what hasn't worked, and see if there's perhaps some learning for CCS in it.
Just come back on Marie. Let's taking the big picture and aside there, which is the electricity generators. There are two issues here which directly relate to your work. The first is enhanced oil recovery, which is the driving force behind CCS development in North America, and whether or not the Commission cannot be stimulating more work in development of EOR or EGR in Europe. And the second issue is, of course, the EEPR, which we keep coming back to, and we've discussed ourselves. Lots of people discuss this with you, but and though I know there's legal difficulties about redistributing the money that was made available for CCS pilot projects and the like, but it's still one of the pots of money that people keep talking about, despite the doors which keep being closed in the face of those who seek to suggest that money that's not been used should be transferred to projects which have a better chance of realisation. And now that the MFF seems to be, progress seems to be made on that particular issue, maybe this is a matter that we can look at again.
To take on board both of those. oil recovery, enhanced oil recovery in Europe, is happening. It's a commercial reality. It's certainly a commercially viable reality in those parts of Europe where it can be used. But I think we have to be realistic. If you look at the United States, they have an embedded industry, a hydrocarbon industry, both for coal and gas and oil, drilling, exploration, and commercialization. And therefore, the enhanced oil recovery, be it for gas or oil, is a commercial reality, is a commercial opportunity in the States. And if you look at the 8 projects that you mentioned, pretty much all of them are viable because it's commercially viable to do it. I mean, that's the business case. You don't need public intervention if it's commercially viable to do it. In Europe, we don't have as much commercial opportunity for oil recovery. I mean, look at where we get our hydrocarbons, our indigenous hydrocarbons there, primarily in the UK, the North Sea, Norway, a little bit of coal, very spread out, but we've almost no oil. We've almost no onshore oil in Europe. So the opportunity to make a business case, make a commercial business case based on oil recovery for CCS in Europe is much less than it is in the United States. And that's why I raised the issue of storage, because for Europe, CCS means taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it. And that's where our business case falls down. I mean, in any commercial, leaving aside whether you do have public support or you don't have public support, in any commercial operation where you basically take a waste product and you store it, that's a cost. And you're not getting a return for it. You're not getting a commercial return for it. So you then have to put into place factors that make it economically realistic to do that as a cost exercise. And that's really the dilemma that we face in Europe versus, for example, what happens in the United States. On the recovery package, I mean, the Bible is that, and indeed the Parliament insists upon this too, that we have fiscal rules, that we have financial rules that we must follow in terms of our budget. Money that is not expended within a given year is decommitted, and money that is decommitted is returned to the national budgets of the member states. And the member states are not prepared to take their hands off it and give it back to us. So maybe, there's some magical world that will happen after the MFF is adopted and member states will change their view on that. But, let's wait and see. On the other hand, of course, we do have the NER 300 second round coming down the track. There is funding available there. We really do hope we will see CCS projects in it. We were very disappointed that in the first round of NER, there was no CCS project ultimately retained. And I really hope we don't find ourselves in the same situation coming out of NER 300 the second round. And I will point the finger very clearly to the fact that effectively at the last moment, member states backed down and did not support it. There is no shortage of financial support from the European Union. By that I mean the Parliament, even the Council as such, and the Commission. There is financial support there. We're not getting the commitment on the ground from the member states, even when it's happening in their own territory.
Yeah, fine.
This is just a very quick comment on CO2 EUR, because we are doing actually, as IEA, we're doing some work on CO2 EUR, and what you're saying is spot on. CO2 EUR right now is undertaken as a commercial business because oil companies want to make money. What we are trying to do is, however, is to actually open up the CO2 EUR debate a little bit, because it can potentially provide a migration path into large-scale CCS deployment. The opportunities created by EOR will be small. So if you look at the US, around 60 million tons of CO2 are going to be ejected, which is not very much. Okay, but again, there's a migration path for a larger scale deployment out there. And this migration path would evolve around the following thinking. if I, as an operator, do my CO2 ER flood. So in a CO2 ER project, you put CO2 in on one's in an injection well, and the idea is that you actually enhance oil recovery. And because CO2 is a cost factor, the current ER operations are always run in such a way that you actually use the minimum amount of CO2 for injecting. But you actually can put incentives in place, actually climate change incentive, to actually use the not the maximum amount, but to use more CO2. So you're getting then in the theme of co-optimization. So you're optimizing the oil recovery, but you're also optimizing the CO2 intake. Obviously, that is not commercial right now, and here is, of course, then the space where policy interaction actually could take place.